All right. Hello and welcome to another live edition of the Mike Sennello Show. Only 2 days till Election Day. So we are going to be going over some topics that might be pertinent to your decision making on Tuesday. And the topic that is going to completely dominate the discussion is going to be the burying of electrical lines underground. This is called undergrounding. And we will get into exactly what that is. Excuse me, I believe I have to get this a bit more centered. Yeah, that's a little bit more centered. So the reason we are doing this, and I feel like I'm doing Craig Miner's homework in doing this, but the reason we are doing this is because there is a candidate for Connecticut's 30th Senate District who seems to believe that this is something that should be imposed on the taxpayers for all intents and purposes. You're hearing from his side of the campaign trail that I guess we need to get a little bit further over towards that. There we go. All right. So one side of the campaign aisle is suggesting that we should effectively force Eversource to bury these power lines. And one of the considerations that you have to make when doing a proper cost-benefit analysis of a project is, yes, to look at the benefits of the project, but also to look at the costs of the project. And that's because costs matter. People care about these things, and for obvious reason. And that reason is fundamentally that there is this thing called scarcity. And I can't believe I have to talk about this, but there is this thing called scarcity. And it's an axiomatically unavoidable element of any aspect of our of economics. In fact, it's one of the it is straight up middle school economics. Well, no, it's not middle school economics. It is the first lesson you learn in economics. This is how basic this lesson is. If I were to go onto my bookshelf right there and pull my economics textbook off the bookshelf, I've done this before on my YouTube channel, by the way, folks, and read from it. That's my YouTube channel being Captain Phoenix, all one word. Check that out. I've done it a few times. Page 1, paragraph 1 is scarcity. It's the definition of scarcity, goes into what scarcity is, and most importantly, it makes the point that, and this is axiomatically true, it is unavoidable. And we won't get into too much detail of what scarcity is, but because scarcity exists, when you have I'll give you for instance, time is a scarce resource. The money that you generate in terms of revenue from something like tax collection is a scarce resource, which means that since these resources are scarce, and they always will be, you need to have some way of allocating those scarce resources. In a market society, when you have to respond to market influences, the way that that's done is with prices. And we found out and Smith's lesson, We've known this again for almost 250 years. The lesson that Smith taught us is that prices are the most effective way of determining what people are willing to actually spend money on and where those costs and benefits are over time, because those transactions are being done in a mutually consensual manner. And that's, again, an axiomatic truth of mutually consensual transactions is that everybody wins. I have done a series on interference that goes into that in great detail on my channel. That's Captain Phoenix on YouTube. And I've also done a very lengthy read on Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations on my sister channel. That's Mike Reed, whose link is in this video's description. So go ahead and check that out. So, of course, you're going to have to make a cost consideration here. Because whatever money and whatever time and whatever resources you devote to this project, you are going to be necessarily incapable of devoting those resources simultaneously to another project. Human beings aren't quantum particles. They can't exist in two places at the same time. This is like really basic stuff here. And I can't believe I have to say this, but we do have to have that cost consideration. And the cost consideration, of course, is what we're referring to as undergrounding. So what undergrounding is, and we're going to talk about this, word's going to come up a lot, is the burying of existing overhead lines underground. This is not the construction of new underground lines when those overhead lines weren't in existence. It's a very different price structure, and it's a very different process. What's interesting is that we have all of this information. All of this information has already been done. All of this information has already been collected. And of all things, it's already been done and collected here in Connecticut by the Connecticut General Assembly in 2011. And because I'm a good faith actor, instead of taking a screenshot of a study that doesn't prove your point and then not linking to the research, I'm not only going to show you all the research, and we're going to go into a pretty dry read of the entire study. It's about 4 or 5 pages, so it'll probably take up about 30 to 40 minutes of our show. I'll link to it in this comment section. So for those interested, this is the report. This is the OLR research report, which is entitled Undergrounding Electric Lines by Kevin McCarthy, who is the principal analyst for this report. So, like I mentioned, I will copy and paste into the comment section that report right now, so you guys at home can follow along if you'd like. So, let's dive right on into this report. You asked for a discussion of the benefits and costs, so a cost-benefit analysis, of placing electric distribution lines underground, particularly in urban areas. You asked for would be the Connecticut General Assembly. Please note, too, by the way, that this is as of October 3rd, 2011. You also wanted to know whether there are barriers to placing these lines underground. In practice, undergrounding typically involves telecommunications as well as electric lines. This report discusses the costs and benefits of undergrounding both types of lines, but focuses on electric lines. OLR report, whatever, discusses issues surrounding the undergrounding part of the Norwalk Middletown electric transmission line. Summary. This report summarizes recent reports on undergrounding electric distribution lines prepared by public utility commissions in Florida, North Carolina, Oklahoma, and Virginia, a legislative task force in Maryland, and a national study prepared by the Edison Electric Institute, the trade group of investor-owned electric utilities. So, for those people that have been saying that the only information we have is from the utilities companies themselves, it's all biased information. No, it's from public utility commissions in those states. Those aren't public utility companies. Public utility commissions are effectively so when you have the legislature in Florida, they bring on people into a commission to then look at the public utility from an outside perspective, from a neutral perspective. Now, the people that are appointed to these commissions may be done so in a non-politically neutral manner. But the point is that these aren't the utility companies themselves, and that's especially true of a legislative task force in Maryland. A national study prepared by the Edison Electric Institute is a trade group of investor-owned electric utilities. So even if I were to concede that all of these things were just biased BS coming from the evil utility companies, and everything they say is murder. Yeah. Okay. So even if that's the case, the bias you would expect from them would be for these costs to be lower than what they've suggested, because we all know what happens in reality. If these electric companies get the put out a bid and say, hey, we're going to underground some of these lines, and this is what you think it's going to cost. Let's say it's $10 million, or let's say, because there was a project we did this already with in 2000. Let's say it was $64 million. Well, what happens in reality? What's the check that winds up actually getting cut? Because I tell you what, that project in 2000, the building of New Milford High School, whose budget was supposedly going to be $64 million, that budget was exceeded by $20 million before ground was broken. So we all know what happens in reality. Let's be honest with ourselves. Let's not kid ourselves. Let's not be naive. Several of the commission analyses were conducted in the wake of major outages caused by storms and, in the case of Florida and Virginia, were prepared at the direction of the state legislature. So not the utility companies. The primary benefit of placing new or existing distribution lines underground is that it reduces the frequency of outages, particularly those caused by storms. And we're going to get into more detail on what that percentage is later on in this review. Undergrounding reduces the costs of post-storm restoration of the electrical systems and reduces revenue losses for electric utilities resulting from these outages. So what does that mean? That the cost of individually repairing a break is reduced by undergrounding it? No. That means that, in all likelihood, what they're suggesting here is that because you've completely redone the system, repairs to the system as a whole are lesser, which means that the way I'm interpreting that is there's a whole lot less damage that you have to bother repairing. Therefore, as a system as a whole, when it comes time to deal with storm damage, there's less damage as a whole to deal with. And this is also true of, remember that conversation we had a few episodes ago where we talked about how Lewis Tree sent 6 guys in 3 expensive-ass trucks to sit there and wait for 8 hours before finally bailing for a lineman to come and flip a switch? Yeah. Well, what happens when that lineman doesn't have to come and flip a switch? If those lines are underground, yeah, they're done with that job in like half an hour. So instead of getting billed for 8 hours for nothing, you get billed for 30 minutes, and then you go home and you move on. So this is obviously a true benefit to bringing those lines underground. Undergrounding, let's see, here we go. Undergrounding substantially reduces the cost of tree trimming and other vegetation management and damages to electric facilities caused by vehicular crashes. Right, because you don't have to do any of those things. It reduces the risk of the public, excuse me, I'll have to excuse your typo, coming in contact with live wires. In addition, undergrounding provides aesthetic benefits by reducing visual clutter. This may increase the value of nearby properties, although this issue is not analyzed in the reports summarized below. On the other hand, undergrounding is expensive, and oh boy is it expensive, as we'll find out momentarily. According to the EEI, building a new overhead distribution line costs between $136,000 and $197,000 per mile. Remember, that's overhead, depending on several factors, including population density of the area served, urban areas being the most expensive. The cost of new underground lines ranges from between $409,000 and $559,000 per mile. The Virginia Commission estimated the cost of new underground lines to be 4 to 6 times more expensive than new overhead lines. Remember, 2011 dollars. Undergrounding existing overhead facilities is even more expensive. The Virginia Commission found that, quote, the relocation of currently existing overhead lines would result in tremendous costs and significant disruptions, and could take decades to complete, end quote. It estimated that the cost of placing all existing electrical distribution lines in the state underground would be about $83 billion, or the more important number, because Virginia is not Connecticut, $3,000 per customer per year. Now, we'll get into more detail as to why exactly that is, but obviously the capital investment here isn't just going to be eaten by the utility company, and obviously it's not just going to come as a tax, a one-time tax to everybody, because nobody has, well, I don't know what that would work out to, probably around $40,000 to $50,000 to just dump into something like this. The whole thing is going to get amortized, and we are going to get into what people already pay on their electric bill to determine how much of an effect that $3,000 a year in Virginia in 2011 is going to influence your electric bill. Undergrounding telecommunications lines statewide would cost an additional $11 billion. So that's an increase of roughly 12%. So you can imagine that $3,000 is going to be probably around $3,300 or $3,400 on top of all that. The Florida, Oklahoma, and North Carolina commissions made similar findings. We have not been able to find any general cost estimates for undergrounding in Connecticut. However, several years ago, Yale University proposed to build a new biology building on Whitney Avenue in New Haven. As part of the project, the university proposed to bury the existing electric and telecommunications lines on both sides of the avenue from Edwards Street to Trumbull Street, a distance of 1/2 mile. Now, that is a very small n. That is a very small sample size, so it's going to be difficult to extrapolate with any relevancy that number. The architect for the project, Pelly Clark Pelly, estimates that undergrounding the lines in this area, which primarily serves commercial and institutional customers, would cost approximately $2 million. So basic arithmetic, $4 million per mile. Now, again, I've already mentioned the flaw in doing this back of the envelope math on such a small sample size. So flaw acknowledged. There are several disadvantages to undergrounding besides costs. While underground lines experience fewer outages than overhead lines, it is more difficult to find faults on them than overhead lines, and they take longer to repair. Okay, so those of you that have said online, and I really want to name names, but it's not appropriate, but you know who you are, and everybody knows who they are. And to everyone that said, oh, repairing an underground line and finding a break in an underground line is just as easy as to do an overhead line. It just doesn't take any longer to do any of that work. You're full of malarkey. Well, myth busted. Also, this should be pretty obviously true. How do you find a break in a line that's overhead? Oh, well, look, there it is. How do you find a break that's underground? well, it's underground, so you can't just go, oh, well, look, there it is. No, you have to turn off power to that section, and then you have to pump DC, direct current, and down into that line. You have to get out what looks like a metal detector, and then you have to trace the line. And that still doesn't always work perfectly, and it only allows you to find a single break, which means if there's further breaks in the line, when you test the load, because you'll have to test the load, you may find that there is a further disruption. However, if there's a further disruption in the line overhead, how do you determine if there's a further disruption? Oh, look, there it is. Yeah, so again, myth busted. Underground lines are less capable of dealing with overloads and are more complicated to upgrade or modify. Yet another myth that's pervading our community, busted. Undergrounding in urban areas has several additional barriers. Underground lines need boxes for switches and other equipment. These boxes, which are located above ground, are typically 6 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 4 feet high. In densely populated urban areas, there may be insufficient room in the existing utility easement for the boxes. In some cases, undergrounding existing lines would require the utility to acquire new easements. New easements may be needed when the utility only has a right to use the space above the surface or when the existing overhead route is inappropriate for an underground line. E.g., when a line goes over a water body, say like the Housatonic River. Obtaining new easements may be particularly difficult in urban areas where lots are small. In addition, building underground lines in an urban area may require the use of directional boring rather than trenching, which is less expensive in order to minimize disruptions to streets and driveways. So conventional trenching is where you take where you make an open top and trench. Everyone knows what a trench looks like. You get out your trencher. It looks like a car-sized chainsaw, and it goes and just digs out a trench. Easy peasy. Directional boring is when you take basically a tube and you ram it into the ground, and then you make like a cave underneath an object that you need to get through. In the directional boring, I've seen done with air. I've seen it done with water. I've seen it done with steam. I've seen it done with actual boring bits. So there's a lot of ways you can go ahead and do that. Nonetheless, several states and many municipalities require that new distribution systems be undergrounded. The staff of the Florida Commission recommended undergrounding of existing systems in several cases, such as when utilities need to relocate their lines in conjunction with road construction. So if there is a benefit, a net benefit to our cost-benefit analysis, it needs to be significantly more nuanced than we like it, so you have to do it. Background. The electric distribution system transports electricity from substations to homes and businesses. Power travels along feeder lines, which usually follow main roads. Tap lines or laterals branch off the feeder lines and run along side streets through neighborhoods to homes and businesses. The system also includes transformers that reduce the voltage to the level generally used in homes or businesses, 120 to 480 volts. The transformers are mounted on poles near the premises for overhead services or in boxes at ground level for underground services. From the transformer, the electricity enters the residence or building through a service drop. Again, this is kind of unimportant. It's just informing people on how this all works, how the grid actually works. All of the parts of the distribution circuit can be placed underground, and undergrounding is common in many parts of the country for new subdivisions and other large developments. A number of jurisdictions require undergrounding of new lines. For example, Maryland requires that all distribution lines for new subdivisions be placed underground. Since 1967, the California Public Utilities Commission has required that all new services connections be placed underground. Big surprise that California forces on people, as a whole state, the most expensive option. It has also established a ratepayer-supported fund to help pay for undergrounding existing lines. Yeah, socialism, folks. Welcome to California. All investor-owned utilities in Florida are required to have a process where customers can opt to underground existing overhead services by paying the incremental cost. Incremental costs are the costs in addition to what you would otherwise incur. Public Utility Commission Analyses, Florida, 2007 and 2008. In 2006, the Florida Public Service Commission directed each investor-owned electricity utility in the state to investigate the implications of converting their overhead electric distribution systems to underground. The primary focus of the project was the impact of undergrounding on the performance of the electrical infrastructure during hurricanes, i.e. the ability of the electric system to withstand high winds, storm surges, and other damage from hurricanes, and to maximize the number and duration of customer interruptions. The project was divided into 3 phases. Phase 1, published in 2007, reviewed existing research reports, methodologies, and case studies. The literature reviewed identified a range of benefits and costs of undergrounding. The benefits include increased reliability, improved aesthetics, and decreased costs for vegetation management. We already talked about this. On the other hand, the review found that an average cost of $1 million per mile, again, 2007, although it noted that actual costs could vary widely depending on customer density, terrain, and other factors. And we'll talk about what that variance is shortly. The review found that the costs of undergrounding are, quote, far in excess of the quantifiable benefits presented in existing studies, except in rare cases where the facilities provide particularly high reliability gains or otherwise have a higher than average impact on community goals, end quote. And again, we'll get into that data in a minute. The literature indicated that the wholesale conversion of overhead distribution systems underground would require electricity rates to approximately double. So folks at home who are outraged that Eversource are basically forced onto them a doubling or near tripling of their electric rates, wait till we bury the lines underground. Remember, this literature indicated that the wholesale conversion of overhead distribution systems underground would require electricity rates to approximately double. The phase of the report is available and you guys can go ahead and check out that link. Phase 2, also published in 2007, examined 4 underground projects in Florida, 2 of which were done in conjunction with road widening. In 2, the underground lines were substantially longer than the overhead lines they replaced by 100% in one case and by 143%. So by 100% means doubling. By 143 means almost multiplying by almost 2.5. The increased length in these cases was due to an underground loop that was built to provide flexibility in responding to outages. Preliminary data indicated that undergrounding did not significantly affect the reliability of the affected circuit outside of storms. It found that the high initial costs of undergrounding were not fully justified by such things as reduced hurricane damage and reduced operations and management costs. The Phase 2 report is available here. Phase 3 was published in 2008. It developed and tested methodology for analyzing the costs and benefits of specific undergrounding proposals. The methodology has 2 components, a normal weather assessment and a hurricane assessment. The model used in the normal weather assessment includes the basic cost of utility capital and operations. It also includes reliability information that allows for the calculation of customer interruption rates and interruption-related costs. The hurricane model determines infrastructure damage and related costs associated with tropical storms and hurricane strength that make landfall in Florida. The report notes that there are several intangible benefits and costs to undergrounding. These include aesthetic benefits such as elimination of overhead facilities, improved landscaping, and the potential positive impact on property values. The intangible costs include reduced flexibility for both utility operations and system expansion. Undergrounding can have an adverse environmental impact, including erosion and disruption of ecologically sensitive habitats. The report notes that underground equipment is prone to damage by storm surges and hurricanes and by excavations near the lines. The time needed to repair underground lines is often longer than for overhead lines, and the specialized crews needed for underground repairs are often scarce during restoration. Again, this should be self-evident, but again, myth busted. The report concludes that, quote, it is quite possible that undergrounding an existing overhead system in a coastal area may result in more hurricane damage and longer restoration times for customers, end quote. The emphasis was in the original. That means the italic stuff was in the original. The Phase 3 report is available at North Carolina, 2003. Remember, again, we're using $2003. In December 2002, a major ice storm blanketed much of North Carolina with up to 1 inch of ice, causing a power outage to approximately 2 million customers. Does that sound familiar? Do we remember the 2011 storm? Maybe this is why this report's coming out. In the aftermath of the storm, the public expressed considerable interest in burying all overhead power lines in the state. The staff of the Public Utility Commission responded by investigating the desirability and feasibility of converting the existing overhead lines of the state's 3 investor-owned electric utilities to underground. The investigation, 1, compared the operational advantages and disadvantages of overhead and underground power distribution systems. 2, estimated and compared the capital costs of converting overhead lines to underground, along with the differences in operation and maintenance, O&M, costs for the 2 types of systems. 3, estimated the time and human resources required to bury underground lines. 4, identified potential additional costs to customers, municipalities, and other utilities that may result from conversion. And 5, explored options for financing conversion projects. The investigation identified the major arguments for undergrounding. These include reduced maintenance, smaller rights of way, less susceptibility to weather damage, fewer traffic accidents involving poles, improved aesthetics, and increased property values. The investigation found that underground systems are more reliable than overhead systems during normal weather conditions. Based on 5 years of reliability data, the state's utilities experienced an average annual system rate of 0.57 interruptions per mile of overhead line, compared to 0.3 interruptions per mile of underground line. So folks, here's the benefit to undergrounding these lines for all intents and purposes. We're going to reduce the likelihood that these lines have breaks by 50%. We're going to reduce the outages that you experience, the likelihood that you're experiencing an outage, by a whopping 50%. So I really hope that the costs we're going to be talking about are worth that 50% improvement. Like the previous studies, the investigation found that the principal barrier to undergrounding is cost. It determined that undergrounding existing overhead distribution lines would be, quote, prohibitively expensive, end quote. It estimated that costs of undergrounding varied by population density, averaging $218,000 per mile in low-density rural areas to more than $2 million per mile in urban areas. Rates would also be affected by the higher O&M costs associated with underground systems, particularly in urban areas where underground conductors are 4 times more costly to maintain than overhead facilities. Remember that, where underground conductors are 4 times more costly to maintain than overhead facilities. So my friends on that certain page that we'll go and mention that say that it's not, again, myth busted. In addition to the impact on the cost of providing utility service, conversion to underground lines would impose costs on individual customers, municipalities, and other utilities. For example, customers would need to replace their service drops, which would cost an average of $1,481 per customer in suburban areas and $2,346 in rural areas. The cost for urban areas is included in the $2 million per mile estimate. Okay, remember, again, $2,002 to $2,003 in North Carolina. So remember, that $1,481 is probably going to be a hell of a lot more today in Connecticut than it was almost 20 years ago in North Carolina. The investigation found the overall O&M costs for typical underground systems to be nearly identical to overhead systems. So $920 per mile per year compared to $917 per mile for overhead systems. However, the O&M costs for duct bank systems are nearly 4 times as high. So again, we're not really saving anything in a best case scenario in terms of operations and maintenance, in terms of basic maintenance, to bury these lines underground. These systems, and that's in the best case scenario. In a worst case scenario, it could be a whole lot more. These systems are used primarily in larger cities to serve commercial loads. Statewide, the undertaking would cost approximately $41 billion. Again, North Carolina, $2,002 to $2,003, nearly 6 times the net book value of the utility's current distribution assets. So basically, one way we could calculate these costs is to take all of the net assets that are owned by that are owned by Eversource, and multiplying that number by 6 times whatever that net asset value is. I can't imagine what that cost would be. Statewide undergrounding would require 237 million man-hours and approximately 25 years to complete. The capital investment would increase an average residential customer's monthly electric bill by more than 125%. Increase by means that it's more than doubling. According to the investigation, statewide undergrounding would increase commercial rates by 162.6% and industrial rates by 216%. So again, almost tripling and more than tripling. Remember, increasing by isn't increased to, it's increasing by. The investigation found other disadvantages to undergrounding. The utility data demonstrated that the typical underground outage takes 145 minutes to repair compared to 92 minutes for an overhead outage. That means that if you lose power, you're going to lose it for 50% longer than you did. So if you lost it for a week and you really were pissed about Eversource not getting their act together and getting it cleaned up faster. If Eversource is still that company, do you think they're going to get any better about this? No. In fact, if we underground the lines, that week is going to turn into a week and a half, folks. An overhead distribution system is more flexible than an underground system. For example, tapping an overhead line to serve additional load is a relatively easy and low-cost task. Tapping an underground line is much more complicated, time-consuming, and costly. If trenching for an underground system takes place near existing trees, there is a possibility that root systems will be damaged and eventually weaken or kill the trees. In addition, properly maintained underground right-of-way must be kept clear of trees. Tapping is where you have the existing line and you tap into that line. You add another line by just connecting to the existing line. In spite of these disadvantages, the Commission encouraged each electric utility to, 1, identify the overhead facilities in each region that it serves that repeatedly experience reliable problems based on measures such as the number of outages or number of customer hours out of service. 2, determine whether undergrounding is a cost-effective option for improving the reliability of those facilities. And 3, develop a plan for converting facilities where undergrounding is cost-effective in an orderly and efficient manner, taking into account the outage histories and the impact on service reliability. The investigation is available at Oklahoma, 2008. Okay, we're getting newer. We're getting more recent, but still over a decade ago. In 2008, the Oklahoma Corporation Commission issued a staff report on undergrounding electric facilities. The study came in the wake of a major ice storm that resulted in more than 600,000 customers being without power. That sounds familiar. The study identified the major benefits of undergrounding as significantly fewer outages, decreased costs for vegetation management, fewer lost electricity sales both day to day and after the storms, improved public safety from reduced live wire contact, and improved aesthetics due to less clutter. So exactly the same benefits that we've talked about throughout this entire conversation. On the other hand, the staff found that underground lines are much more expensive to build than overhead lines. It also found that faults on overhead lines can be identified more easily than on underground lines. How many times we have to do this, and can be repaired more quickly. As a result, outages that occur on underground lines are longer than those caused by faults on overhead lines. Steve Confortini, you want to share this video? You want to share this information? And for the record, if Steve isn't watching, folks, make sure we get Steve on today, because he's had this conversation. He knows who I'm talking about. Go ahead, Steve, share this video. The staff also noted that underground lines are less capable of coping with overloads than overhead lines and present greater risk of utility employee hazards. The study estimated the cost of undergrounding undergrounding existing distribution lines at between $435,000 and $2.5 million per mile, depending on certain conditions, resulting in an estimated statewide cost of $30.5 billion. Part of the cost is for materials. The Commission estimated that underground lines cost 10 to 14 times as much as overhead wires carrying the same voltage. In addition, to minimize damage from water and to meet insulation and heat dissipation requirements, underground lines are much thicker and heavier than overhead lines designed to carry the same amount of power. As a result, only short segments of underground lines can be pulled through conduit, requiring splices and underground access vaults every few thousand feet, depending on the line's voltage. The study also noted that if overhead lines are abandoned before they are fully paid for, customers are liable for the resulting stranded costs. So hidden costs is what they're talking about here. The staff that concluded that requiring electric utilities to underground all of their facilities is generally not a feasible solution. However, they recommended 1, burying all new lateral distribution lines, those that serve neighborhoods, except where low population density makes it impractical. 2, burying all existing lateral distribution lines when requested by a majority of customers in a neighborhood. 3, burying fully urbanized main distribution lines when wires are replaced. And 4, requiring utilities to underground distribution lines when relocating for major road and highway projects. The report is available at Virginia, 2005. So we've gotten a little bit older on our reports, and we are most of the way through this study, folks, so bear with us. In 2004, the state legislature requested the Virginia Corporations Commission to study the feasibility costs and funding options regarding placing existing and future utility distribution lines underground. Part of the motivation for the study was Hurricane Isabel. The study looked at an unusually wide range of variables. In addition to looking at construction and operation costs, it considered the cost of rebuilding a system after a 100-year storm, the loss of electric utility revenues from outages, and various costs associated with vehicle crashes with utility poles. Commission staff also prepared a case study of undergrounding an existing line in the city of Norfolk. The study found that the primary advantages of undergrounding were improved aesthetics and overall improved reliability. Underground systems fail less often, and the average customer outage time, average over all customers, is generally less than for overhead systems. Undergrounding nearly eliminates the need for extensive restoration efforts after catastrophic storms. It also eliminates most momentary outages, those that occur when a tree brushes against an overhead line. Underground lines require little tree trimming and are much less susceptible to vehicle accidents. Again, all the benefits we've already been talking about. But the study also found that the relocation of currently existing overhead lines would result in tremendous costs and significant disruptions. In addition, a major relocation initiative could take decades to complete and encounter complications regarding underground damage prevention and attainment of new easements. So what does that mean? That means that whatever the bill is estimated to be at the beginning of the project is probably not the bill we're going to pay. It's probably going to be a lot more. Number two, it means that because you have to install these lines, there's going to be temporary outages while you're doing the work, inherent to doing the work. And number three, that's going to continue for decades. In Virginia, at the time of the study, the cost of building new overhead lines ranged from $10,000 to $250,000 per mile, depending on terrain, voltage, and labor costs. The cost of new underground lines was $40,000 to $1.5 million per mile. Now, that's a huge, completely unusable range. But remember, this is the cost of new underground lines. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about undergrounding existing lines. According to the study, the cost of placing existing distribution lines underground, which is what we care about, would be much higher than the cost of new construction. It estimates that undergrounding existing facilities would cost $150,000 to $3 million per mile. So anywhere from 2 to basically 4 times the cost, with costs higher in urban than rural areas. The major costs were 1, materials associated with new underground facilities, the net of the salvage value of the old facilities, 2, labor for removing the old facilities, installing the new facilities, mostly trenching or boring, 3, administration and overhead, 4, contingencies, and 5, acquisition of new easements. The study estimated that the cost of placing all existing electric distribution lines in the state underground would be about $83 billion. This would be approximately $3,000 per customer per year. Customers would also face a one-time cost of $1,000 to $7,000 to replace their service drops. In addition, the cost of burying existing telecommunications lines would be an additional $11 billion, and we talked about this before. According to the study, electric and telecommunication facilities are typically placed in separate trenches with separate construction schedules, which makes sense for doing repairs and those sort of things. The study estimated that undergrounding would produce annual savings and avoid costs for the economy and electric utilities of at most, about $3.9 billion, or about 5% of the cost of placing electric lines underground. There's your cost-benefit analysis, folks, right there. The study estimated that undergrounding would produce an annual savings and avoid costs for the economy and electric utilities of, at most, $3.9 billion of that $83 billion, or about 5% of the cost of placing electric lines underground. The study concluded that the potential benefits, both to the economy and the utilities of undergrounding, did not appear to offset the initial construction costs. No kidding. It found that placing all new distribution lines underground, while less costly, is probably not cost effective. So even when in Virginia, they decided that even when we're talking about new installation, it's not worth the money. However, the study noted that its estimates of benefits and costs were not based on detailed engineering studies and to contain a significant amount of uncertainty. That's the huge range we talked about earlier. In particular, actual costs are highly case-specific and may vary substantially from the study's estimates, which we talked about. One potential barrier to undergrounding, particularly in urban areas, is the amount of space needed for switches, transformers, and other equipment associated with underground utilities. This equipment is placed in a box that's typically 6 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 4 feet high. The box needs a large open space around it to open its access doors. One issue addressed by the study, although not quantified, was the easements needed to underground facilities. So that means the property you're going to need to buy in addition to the property you already own. For all intents and purposes, easements don't necessarily mean you're buying the property. You're buying access to the property at least. It notes that some, but not all, overhead utility easements have provisions for the installation of underground facilities. This could require the acquisition excuse me, just got to make sure that we are still live here. It looks like I have to do a quick bit of a refresh. It says live video interrupted. Okay. Great job, Facebook. Love the live API. One issue just by the study, but not quantified, was the easements. The case study analyzed the cost of undergrounding electric and telecommunications. This could require the acquisition of new easements from numerous property owners. In some areas where existing overhead lines cross wetlands, bodies of water, or rough terrain, relocation of the line over the existing route may not be appropriate. In some cases, longer routes would be needed, which could increase construction costs. The case study analyzed the cost of undergrounding electric and telecommunications line in a 7-mile section of Route 60 in Norfolk. The utilities serving the area estimated the cost of undergrounding at $54 million, the vast majority of which was for the power lines. They estimated that the project would take 2 to 5 years to complete for a lousy 7-mile stretch. According to the local electric utility, the high cost of the project, $7.7 million per mile, was due to the limited space available to install facilities and the need to bury the line more than 4 feet deep to avoid conflicts with existing infrastructure. The deeper trenches add costs for excavations, shoring, and water removal, of course. The overall study concluded that a comprehensive statewide initiative to underground all existing overhead lines does not appear to be reasonable, although it noted some targeted local initiatives. The local initiatives have implementation schedules that can be as long as 50 years. The study is available at Maryland Legislative Task Force, 2003. Remember, we're talking $2003. Legislation adopted in 2002 established a task force to prepare recommendations on how to facilitate and reduce the cost of undergrounding utility lines. It submitted its report in 2003. The task force made a number of findings that were similar to those made by the Public Utility Commissions described above. These include that, 1, in many cases, improved aesthetics is the primary reason to underground facilities. Jeez. 2, undergrounding can enhance public safety. 3, these reasons are sufficient to support undergrounding in some cases. 4, undergrounding is very expensive. The utility member of this task force estimated an average cost of undergrounding electric lines at $900,000 per mile, with an additional $100,000 for telecommunications lines. 5, economies can be achieved by undergrounding electric and telecommunication lines simultaneously or integrating undergrounding with other infrastructure work, such as highway reconstruction. That means that if you're doing work anyways, you may save time and you may save money in the long run to do the work to underground those lines than to just arbitrarily underground them. 6, while undergrounding reduces the frequency of outages, the outages take longer to repair, and thus the overall effect of undergrounding on reliability is questionable. Hey, Steve. Nice of you to join in. I'm sure hoping you're here with us. Remember, share this link, Steve, with our friends on that page. The task force made several recommendations, including that 1, the State Department of Planning, somewhat equivalent to the Office of Policy Management in Connecticut, should serve as a clearinghouse for municipalities and groups interested in undergrounding. And 2, the department, state, and local highway authorities, municipalities, should identify opportunities for undergrounding and construction and repair work and work closely together. The task force is available at... I just want to make sure that you guys can see this thing because it's only scrolls down so far. All right, yeah, okay. Edison Electric Institute, 2009. EI reviewed the studies discussed above, as well as several earlier studies, and identified a very wide range of potential benefits and costs of undergrounding. In addition to the benefits described above, it notes that undergrounding eliminates outages caused by animals, for example, squirrels, provides greater reliability and lower route congestion near urban substations, and allows maintenance to occur at ground level rather than requiring the use of bucket trucks. It also noted that one of the major benefits of undergrounding from the utilities perspective is that it creates positive community relations by reducing the visual impact of the distribution system. That's that aesthetic we talked about. The study reviewed available reliability data for investor-owned utilities and found that underground systems have slightly better overall reliability than overall overhead systems. Let's repeat that. Have slightly better overall reliability than overhead systems, with the decreased frequency of outages being largely offset by the increased time needed to restore power. On the other hand, underground lines have more complex operational needs than overhead lines. For example, installation of underground lines requires much more coordination between the utility and the customer. It is not possible to inspect underground lines from the ground, which, remember, it is not possible to inspect underground lines from the ground, which makes them more costly to maintain. Underground equipment typically has a shorter lifespan than overhead equipment, on average 30 years versus 50 years, increasing the long-term costs of underground systems. According to EEI, building a new overhead distribution line costs between $136,000 and $197,000 per mile, depending on several factors including population density, urban areas being the most expensive. The cost of new underground lines ranges between $409,000 and $559,000 per mile. It found an average cost of underground lines to be $724,000 per mile in suburban areas and $823,000 per mile in urban areas. The report also has an extended discussion of state policies and utility approaches to undergrounding. The report is available at. So, okay, so now we have something to tell us at least what the benefits could potentially be and the costs are. And if we take that EEI number, somewhere between $724,000 and $823,000 per mile, and the reason I'm using this range is because it's the narrowest range that's been offered. And on top of that, it's apparently the most recent numbers that we have. So if we call it just a nice even $800,000 per mile, well, we can math this out. So let's do the math for all of this, right? And the first thing we need to do is we need to talk about CPI. So obviously, $2,009 are not $2,020. So what we need to do is we need to conduct a inflation calculation. So this isn't a perfect way of doing it, but here's what we can do. And you see it here as from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. We're looking at basically $1 million per mile, which is what pretty much everyone had been saying all along. So if we take that $1 million per mile and figure out how many miles we have, which we actually can do. So let me pull up how many miles we have. According to Eversource's own customer profile, the company operates more than 3,949 circuit miles of electric transmission lines, 40,542 circuit miles of electric overhead distribution lines. Okay. So for easy math, if we work that out to just say 40,000 miles and we multiply that by $1 million a mile, we're talking about a $40 billion project. And of course, you know that these estimates are going to be higher than what they are. But the thing is that how is this actually going to wind up getting paid? Because the reality is that we are not going to just simply eat that cost. The reality is that there is no way for the state who is in financial disrepair. I've talked about this before. We are routinely ranked either dead last or very near dead last in terms of financial solvency as a state. We can't afford to just dole out $40 billion. We don't have a printing press for money. That would be at the federal level where the Treasury Department has that ability to just print money. So what are we going to have to do with all this? Well, the reality is that the utility company is basically going to eat those costs and then pass them on to you and me. And the way that that's going to happen is through an amortization process. That means that we're going to pay off a note of $40 billion over the course of, let's say, 20 years. Well, what's going to matter then is how many customers do we have here? Well, let's go back to our customer profile and let's scroll down a little bit. Oh, Connecticut has 1.2 million electrical customers. Okay, so we can do the math. Here, let me just make that transition real quick. So you guys can see 1.2 million electric customers here in Connecticut. That means that the math that we're talking about here would mean we're looking at an amortization, let's say over 20 years, of $40 billion. What that's going to basically work out to at, say, 4% per year is between $2,400 and $2,500 a year for every single customer. And if you don't mind just bearing with me, I'm going to go ahead and share some of these links, so you guys can follow at home because that's what good faith requires. So excuse me while I copy and paste that into the comments section. So enjoy. That is the link to the Bureau of Labor Statistics CPI calculator. And here, folks, is the link to Eversource's company profile. So you guys can follow along at home if you'd like. But what does that work out to? Like I said, between $2,400 and $2,500 a year is going to be added to your current electric bill. So we're looking at around $200 a month. And I think that estimation is probably going to be woefully underestimating those costs. I think that there's a lot of costs that they talked about that we're not calculating in that back of the envelope math. So how much do Connecticut residents pay in their electric bills as it is? Well, we're not going to be able to talk about the most recent average pricing because there's no data on that. So according to the Connecticut Post, and I'll put a link to this in the comment section as well. According to the Connecticut Post, Connecticut residents pay roughly $187.29 per month on their electric bills. So that is in 2018. So 2018 dollars are not what they are today. And of course, the rates went way up just a few months ago. But again, we don't have any data on that. So if we round that up to a nice even $200, that's roughly $2,400 a year. So you are looking at basically doubling your electric bill. That means that those rates are going to have to double and probably in many cases triple in order to pay for all of this. So folks at home that are outraged at Eversource for doubling and tripling their rates a few months ago, despite their terrible service, how are you going to feel about seeing your rates get doubled or tripled for a project like this, which is going to basically never end? And since the doubling of the rate is going to be amortized over 20 years, what that really means is in perpetuity. So I hope that we take these cost bases into actual consideration, because this is something that you should be doing in any cost benefit analysis. And I can't believe I have to bring up this point, but hey, it's 2020 and there is a certain candidate that doesn't quite get this. There is a certain side of the aisle that doesn't look at costs when talking about a project, especially in the government, in the public sector.